Find your metallic zen in a world of high-speed chaos and digital noise, where peace is found in the precision of the machine. We explore the balance between technology and tranquility through stunning, rhythmic, cinematic visuals. Click subscribe now and find your inner calm in the heart of the future.
Thanksgiving in my family was never really about gratitude. The table was always beautiful. My mother made sure of that. Linen napkins pressed flat, the good china out of its cabinet, candles lit even before the sun went down. From the street, our house looked warm. Curtains glowing amber, the smell of roasting turkey drifting out when someone opened the door. Neighbors would wave and say how lucky we were. I used to think so too. But I knew what waited inside. My brother always arrived first. He'd pull into the driveway in whatever new car he was leasing that year, and my father would be at the door before the engine cut off. That was the ritual. That was how it started every single year. My father walking toward him like he was watching someone important arrive. Not his son, someone important. I was 28 that Thanksgiving. I'd driven 4 hours from Austin in a 2003 Corolla with a busted rear defroster and a check engine light I'd learned to ignore. My brother was standing in the entryway when I walked in, already mid-story about his firm's Q3 numbers. My father was nodding the way he always did, slowly, reverently, the way people nod in church. My mother kissed my cheek and took my coat and asked if I'd eaten anything on the road. That was the greeting. That was my version of it. My brother's name is Todd. He's 34 and he works in commercial real estate in Dallas, which in our family has always been treated as a kind of divine calling. He closes deals, he owns property, he plays golf on Saturdays with men who have the right last names. My father has framed photos of Todd's firm on the wall of his home office, not because Todd is in them, but because the firm exists, and Todd is part of it, and that is enough. I used to search that hallway wall for something of mine. There was nothing. There never had been. I was 12 when I wrote my first program. It was on a hand-me-down desktop my father was going to donate to Goodwill, and I asked if I could keep it, and he shrugged and said, "Fine, it's basically useless anyway." I spent 3 weeks building a simple quiz game. I showed it to my mother. She said, "That's clever, honey," and went back to her crossword. I showed it to my father. He glanced at the screen, said something about how computer games were fine for hobbyists, and asked Todd if he'd finished his history project. Todd had not finished his history project. Pod had not finished his history project. My father helped him. That was the shape of things in our house. Todd was the subject, I was the background. It wasn't cruelty exactly, it was quieter than that. It was the way my father asked Todd about his SAT scores at dinner and asked me to pass the salad. It was the way my mother bought Todd a suit for his first job interview and told me, when I asked about a coding boot camp, that those things were expensive and I should be practical. It was every small choice stacked one on top of the other that said, "We see one future for this family and you are not in it." I carried that for years. I built walls around it. I learned to smile in the right places and say the right things and not take up too much space at holidays. And then I started a company. I was 23 when I quit my job at a mid-sized software consultancy in Austin. I had $11,000 in savings, a studio apartment in a building where the elevator worked, maybe half the time, and an idea I'd been sketching in notebooks for 2 years. Supply chain optimization software, specifically for small regional manufacturers who couldn't afford enterprise-level tools. The kind of company nobody puts on a magazine cover. The kind of work nobody at a Thanksgiving table wants to hear about. I didn't tell my family. Not at first. I told them I was freelancing, which was technically true for about 4 months, and after that it wasn't true at all, but I kept saying it because the alternative was a conversation I wasn't ready to have. The first year was brutal in the specific, unglamorous way that nobody talks about. I ate a lot of canned soup. I had a standing desk I'd built out of 2 IKEA bookcases stacked on top of each other. I went to networking events where I was always the youngest person in the room by about 15 years and smiled and handed out business cards that I'd printed at Staples for $12. I sent cold emails. Most of them went nowhere. Some of them went somewhere. My first real client was a furniture manufacturer in Waco, 42 employees, 3 warehouses, and a logistics operation being run mostly on spreadsheets and tribal knowledge. I spent 6 weeks embedded with their operations team before I wrote a single line of code. I charged them less than I should have. I didn't care. I needed the proof more than the money. The software worked. Their fulfillment errors dropped by 31% in the first quarter. Their operations manager called me at 8 in the morning on a Tuesday to tell me. I sat on my bathroom floor and cried for about 10 minutes and then got up and sent them an invoice. I did not call my parents. I didn't call them when I signed my second client or my fifth. I didn't call them when I brought on my first employee, a 25-year-old developer from San Antonio who believed in the product more than I sometimes believed in myself. I didn't call them when we crossed $500,000 in annual recurring revenue or when we crossed $1 million. I kept driving the Corolla. I kept wearing the same rotation of clothes. I kept saying I was freelancing. It wasn't deception exactly, it was protection. I had watched my family dismiss every version of ambition I'd ever shown them, and I did not have enough left in me to hand them one more thing to minimize. The secret wasn't something I kept out of spite. I kept it because I couldn't afford to have them be wrong about me one more time. I needed to finish becoming something before they got the chance to tell me I'd never manage it. So I kept going home for holidays. I kept sitting at that table. I kept listening. Thanksgiving the year I was 26, Todd announced he'd put an offer on a second property. My father poured another glass of wine and said that was exactly the kind of forward thinking he'd raised him to have. My aunt asked me if I was seeing anyone. I said no. She nodded sympathetically and offered me more roles. Thanksgiving the year I was 27, Todd closed a deal worth $7 million, and my father literally stood up from his chair to shake his hand. My mother got tearful. My uncle toasted to the family name. I ate my green bean casserole and thought about the term sheet sitting in my inbox that I hadn't signed yet because I was still negotiating the valuation. I didn't tell them. Thanksgiving the year I was 28 was the last one. I drove up from Austin on a Wednesday evening. The check engine light came on somewhere around Waco, which I chose to interpret as a sign rather than a mechanical problem. I had a 7 a.m. call Thursday morning with our lead investor before I was supposed to be at my parents' house by noon, so I'd booked a room at a Hampton Inn outside of town rather than staying in my childhood bedroom, which my mother had turned into a craft room anyway. My cousin was there when I arrived. She's 2 years younger than me, and she's the only person in my family who has ever asked about my work like she actually wanted to know the answer. She was standing in the kitchen when I came in, cutting celery, and she looked up and smiled the way she always does, like she's actually glad you're there, and asked how Austin was. Good, I said. Busy. She nodded and went back to the celery. She didn't push. She never pushed. But she listened, and that had always been enough. Todd arrived 20 minutes later. He had a new car. I registered this in the abstract way you register weather, and a bottle of wine that he placed on the counter with a particular ceremony he reserved for things he wanted people to notice. He shook my father's hand. They did the thing they always did. He noticed me standing by the refrigerator and said, "Hey you," in the voice he used for people he didn't quite remember, and then he turned back to my father to finish whatever he'd been saying about interest rates. Dinner that year was my mother's usual production. The table set with the things that lived in the cabinet all year waiting for this moment. My grandmother's serving dishes. The gravy boat shaped like a turkey that I'd always found slightly disturbing. Candles. The whole arrangement. We sat down. My father said grace, which he only did at Thanksgiving, and then it started. It always started with Todd. He talked about a development project in Frisco, 42 units, broke ground in September, ahead of schedule. He talked about interest rates and how he was positioned for when they shifted. He talked about a colleague who'd made a mistake and how he would have handled it differently. My father leaned in at all the right moments. My mother passed dishes and smiled. My aunt, seated across from me, eventually turned my direction with the look I'd come to recognize. The slight tilt of the head, the gearing up. "So what's new with you?" she said. "Still doing the computer stuff?" "Still doing the computer stuff?" "Still doing the computer stuff?" I said yes, still busy with that. Todd glanced over. He had a way of looking at me that was never quite dismissive enough to be rude, just slightly past interested, like he was giving me the courtesy of his peripheral vision. "You freelancing, or what's the situation?" he said. "Something like that." He nodded and reached for the cranberry sauce. You should really think about getting into something more stable, he said. Not to me exactly, more to the table in general. Austin's competitive, everyone's got a side hustle, that market's crowded. My father made a sound of agreement. My mother said, "We just want you settled, sweetheart." There it was. Settled. That word had followed me my whole life like a finger pointed at something I was supposed to want. My cousin was quiet. She was looking at her plate in a way that told me she was choosing not to say something. Todd refilled his wine glass and kept going. He was talking about some guy from his MBA cohort who'd tried to start a tech company and ended up back in corporate after 2 years, and there was a lesson in there somewhere, and the lesson was for me, and everyone at the table knew it. My father nodded. My uncle nodded. My aunt made a sympathetic noise in my direction. I cut my turkey. I kept my expression neutral. Here is what they didn't know. 3 weeks earlier, I had been in a conference room in San Francisco at 9 in the morning, sitting across from 2 partners at one of the most respected growth equity firms in the country. One of them had a legal pad in front of him. The other had barely looked up from my desk since I started talking. That one, the one who wasn't looking at me, was the one I'd been watching because that was where the real read was. Halfway through my second slide, he looked up. He said, "Your net revenue retention is 114%. I said, "Yes." He said, "That's not typical for this category." I said, "I know." He put his pen down. He said, "What would you do with 20 million? I told him. We signed the term sheet 8 days later. Series B, $20 million, at a valuation I still had to remind myself was real when I looked at it. The wire cleared 4 days before I drove up to my parents' house for Thanksgiving. I had not told anyone in my family. I had not told anyone outside my company except my attorney and my accountant. I sat at that table and listened to Todd talk about the tech guy who'd failed, and I cut my turkey and I did not say a word. There's a thing that happens when you've been dismissed enough times by the same people. You stop needing them to believe. You start doing it entirely for yourself, which is probably the only sustainable reason to do anything anyway. The secret wasn't power. It was just mine. The only thing they hadn't been able to touch. After dinner, my father poured bourbon in the living room. Todd was on his phone. My mother and aunt were doing dishes. My cousin found me on the back porch, where I'd gone to stand in the cold for a few minutes, and she said, "You okay?" I said I was fine. She said, "You don't have to keep coming to these if they make you feel like nothing." I looked at her. She was 26 and she was the only person in that house who had ever said something like that to me, and I didn't know what to do with it except to stand there and feel how much it meant. I said, "I know." She said, "I mean it. You built something real. I don't know exactly what it is, but I know it's real. You don't owe them the performance." She went back inside. I stood on the porch for another few minutes looking at the November sky. I drove back to the Hampton Inn at 9. My phone lit up around 10 with a message from our head of business development. "A media inquiry," she said. "Not urgent, but you should know. Something about a profile." I looked at it for a second and then put the phone face down and went to sleep. I found out what the inquiry was about 6 weeks later. It was January. I was at my desk in Austin when my director of communications forwarded me a message with 2 words in the subject line: "Heads up." The body of the email said that Inc. magazine was running a piece in their February issue on the 15 fastest-growing B2B software companies under 5 years old. We were number 3 on the list. The piece had quotes from 2 of our clients, a description of our growth trajectory, and my name. I read it twice. I forwarded it to my attorney. I thanked my director of communications. I did not call my parents. The issue hit newsstands on a Tuesday in late January. I know this because by Thursday morning my phone had 9 missed calls. 7 of them were from numbers I didn't recognize. 1 was from my mother. 1 was from Todd. I listened to Todd's voicemail first. He said my name. He said he'd seen something, and he wanted to make sure it was actually, and then there was a pause that lasted long enough for me to understand what was happening inside it. And then he said, "Call me back." My mother's voicemail said, "Honey, your aunt sent me a link. Is this real? Call me." I called my mother. She picked up on the first ring. There was a noise in the background that took me a moment to place. She put me on speaker and there were other voices. I asked who was there. She said, "It's just family. We're all here." I asked which family. "We're all here." I asked which family. "All of us," she said. Todd's here, and your father, and your aunt and uncle. We're having coffee. I asked if she'd called them or if they'd called her. She didn't answer that directly. She said, Emily. I stopped her. My name isn't Emily. My name is Ivy. She said, Ivy, we had no idea. Why didn't you tell us? I sat in my desk chair. Through my window I could see the Austin skyline, the buildings going grayed gold in the winter light. I thought about how to answer that. I thought about the version of the answer that was diplomatic and the version that was honest, and whether there was a version that was both. I said, because the last time I told you I was building something, you told me I should think about something stable. She said that was different. We didn't know. I said, you didn't know because you didn't ask. You didn't ask because you weren't interested. You were interested in Todd. There was silence on the line. My father's voice came through the speaker, lower, the voice he used when he was deciding how to sound reasonable. He said, Ivy, that's not fair. I said, Dad, I started this company at 23 with $11,000. I have never asked you for anything. You have never once asked what I was working on. Not once. Another silence. Todd's voice. He sounded off balance in a way I'd never heard from him. He said, I didn't know it was this serious. You never said. I said, you told me the tech market was crowded and I should think about something stable. At Thanksgiving, 6 weeks ago. He didn't say anything. Here's what I said next, and I mean it the way I said it. Not as a performance, not for the satisfaction of it, but because it was simply the truest thing I could have put into words. I needed to become this without you. I needed to know I could do it without your belief or your support or your approval, and I did, and I'm grateful for that actually, because now I know exactly what I'm capable of when I'm not waiting for anyone to tell me it's okay to try. My mother made a sound that might have been the beginning of crying. My father said, we're proud of you. I let that sit for a moment. I thought about all the times that sentence could have come earlier. All the science fairs and side projects and quiet years of building something in a studio apartment with a borrowed desk and a check engine light I ignored all the way up the highway because I couldn't afford to stop. I said, thank you. I said it and I meant it, and I also meant too late. I said I had a call in 10 minutes, which was true, and that I'd be in touch, which was less certain, and I hung up. My cousin texted me that afternoon. She'd seen the article. She sent a string of emojis, a fire, a small crown, a star, and then she wrote, I told you it was real. I wrote back, you always knew. She wrote, so did you. I put my phone in my desk drawer and went to my 10 o'clock call. It was with a potential client, a regional auto parts distributor in Ohio, 48 locations, inventory problems that had been bleeding them for 3 years. I had a proposed solution and a good demo and a team that had built something worth showing. The call went well. There's no dramatic ending to this. My family didn't transform. My father didn't call with a long apology. Todd didn't show up at my office with a bottle of wine and a changed perspective. My mother sent a card, an actual card, the paper kind with a stamp, that said she was proud, and she hoped I was taking care of myself. And it was the most emotionally direct thing she'd said to me in years, and I put it on my refrigerator and left it there. My cousin came to visit in March. I took her to dinner at a place on South Congress I liked, and we talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing, and she didn't ask me how it felt to prove them wrong because she knew that wasn't the point. The point was never proving them wrong. The point was building something real and true and mine. I still drive the Corolla. Not because I have to, I could get something else. But there's something about it that keeps me honest. It's the car I drove when I was eating canned soup and stacking IKEA bookcases and sending cold emails into the void. It knows what the work felt like before anyone cared. I'm not ready to forget that. There's a question people ask sometimes when they hear a story like mine. They say, would you forgive them? I've thought about it. I think forgiveness is a word people use to mean different things. If it means releasing the weight of it, yes, I did that. Not all at once, but slowly, because carrying it was expensive and the work required everything I had. If it means pretending it didn't happen or that it didn't shape me, no, I won't do that. I'm not interested in rewriting history to make anyone comfortable. What I know is this: I am not waiting anymore. I am not building toward the moment someone at that table finally decides to see me. I built something while they weren't watching, and the not watching was part of what made it possible. You are sometimes most free when no one's expectations are on you, when no one believes in you loudly enough to shape what you think you can do. I drove back to Austin that January afternoon with the ink piece still unread in my bag and my phone quiet in the cup holder and the highway wide and winter gray ahead of me. I turned on the radio, some old song I half knew. I let it play. The check engine light was on. I kept driving. I've thought a lot about what it actually costs to be underestimated for a long time by people who are supposed to know you best, not the anger of it. I've made peace with that, but the specific tax it puts on you every day, the way you have to spend energy just holding yourself together in rooms where you're being quietly reduced. Todd never called me stupid. My father never told me I'd fail. They were too careful for that. What they did was something harder to name. They simply arranged their attention around me like I was furniture they'd decided not to reupholster. Present, acknowledged, not worth the investment. What I know now is that there's a cause and effect to all of it, and it runs in both directions. The dismissal shaped me, yes, but the way I responded to it shaped me more. Every time I sat at that Thanksgiving table and said nothing, I was making a choice. Not to perform for them, not to seek their approval, not to let their version of me become the version I built toward. That choice compounded, quietly, over years. The $600 I made at 2 a.m. in a studio apartment, that happened because nobody was watching. The $220,000 deal at a startup fair nobody in my family knew I'd attended. Same reason. There's something that opens up in you when you stop waiting for permission. When the people who are supposed to believe in you have made it clear they won't, you either collapse into that or you find out what you're made of without the net. I found out. I think about my cousin sometimes when I think about what integrity actually looks like in practice. She didn't have information I didn't have. She couldn't have known what I was building. But she treated me like someone worth paying attention to anyway. She asked questions and then actually listened to the answers. She told me I didn't owe anyone the performance of being less than I was. That's not a small thing. That's someone choosing to see you clearly when it would be easier not to. I learned from that what it feels like to be on the receiving end of real attention, and I try to carry it into how I treat the people around me now. The harder lesson, the one I'm still working through, is what to do with the people who only showed up after the article ran. My father said he was proud of me. My mother sent a card. Todd went quiet in a way that said more than anything he could have spoken out loud. I don't know what to do with sudden pride from people who had years to practice it and didn't. I'm not interested in punishing them for it, but I'm also not going to pretend it doesn't have a shape, that it doesn't sit differently than pride that showed up early when it cost something to give. What I've landed on is this: you don't get to choose who believes in you when you're starting out. That's not in your control. What you get to choose is whether you keep going anyway, whether you treat the doubt as information about them rather than information about you, whether you build the thing while they're not watching and find out, on your own terms, exactly what you're capable of. The check engine light was on the whole drive home. I kept driving. That's the whole story, really. That's the only part that actually mattered.